It started with something small, something easy to miss, a cell phone, lying in the grass. Earbuds tangled around it, and strands of hair twisted through the wires. Silence. Then softly, that was the moment everything changed. On a quiet morning in Northern California, a mother of two vanished during what was supposed to be a normal jog. No witnesses. No screams. No struggle anyone could clearly explain. Just a phone abandoned near a rural intersection, less than a mile from home. Within hours, fear spread through a community. Within days, the entire country was watching. Her name was Asterisk. Sherry. To the outside world, she was the definition of a modern supermom. Energetic, devoted, always present for her children. She volunteered. She stayed fit. She smiled easily. And now, she was gone. As search teams gathered and news vans rolled in, hope and panic lived side by side. Volunteers combed fields and forests. Helicopters scanned from above. Friends printed flyers late into the night, and at the center of it all was her husband standing in front of cameras, voice breaking, pleading for her safe return. Sadly, please just bring her home. Money poured in, donations, support, a reward offered for information. The story had all the elements that grab attention: a young mother, a mysterious disappearance, and the terrifying possibility of a random abduction. But almost immediately, questions began to surface. Investigators noticed details that didn't quite line up. Small things at first, then bigger ones. And as they looked closer, not just at the scene, but at Sherry herself, a more complicated picture began to emerge. Who was she? Really, was she the loving mother everyone believed she was? A victim taken by force, or someone hiding a darker truth? To understand what happened, you have to go back. Not to the morning she vanished, but to the life she lived long before anyone was searching for her. Sherry was born and raised in a small Northern California town. From the outside, it looked ordinary enough. But inside her home, things were anything but stable. Her childhood was marked by chaos, loud arguments, unpredictable moods, and adults who were often distracted by their own struggles. From a young age, Sherry learned how to adapt, how to charm, how to survive. She was energetic, talkative, and magnetic. Teachers described her as bright but restless. Friends said she could light up a room but also stir drama just as easily. There was always something happening around her. Always a story. By her mid-teens, the cracks started to show. Sherry clashed constantly with her parents. She ran away more than once. Police reports from that time described repeated family disputes, emotional outbursts, and stories that didn't always line up when checked. Still, she had a way of pulling people in. In her early 20s, Sherry married for the first time. The relationship was short-lived and unusual. She later described it as practical, not romantic. A decision made for convenience rather than love. When it ended, friends noticed a familiar pattern. Sherry always seemed to be the wronged one, the victim, the person who had been misunderstood. Then came Keith. Keith was the opposite of Sherry in almost every way. Quiet, methodical, dependable. He worked a steady job, paid his bills on time, and avoided conflict whenever possible. Where Sherry was impulsive, Keith was grounded. And for a while, it worked. They married. They settled down. They had children. From the outside, their life looked calm, even ideal. Sherry stayed home with the kids. Keith worked long hours. Neighbors waved. Friends smiled. But behind closed doors, tensions simmered. Arguments happened. Money became a stressor. Trust, once shaken, never fully recovered. And while some people close to them described normal marital problems, others hinted that Sherry's version of events often change depending on who was listening. Still, none of that mattered when she disappeared, because when a woman vanishes without a trace, the past suddenly becomes very important, and investigators were about to examine every piece of it. By the next morning, The search for Sherry had exploded. What began as a handful of worried friends had turned into a full-scale operation. Law enforcement brought in search dogs. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers lined the roads in reflective vests, spreading out across fields, creeks, and wooded trails. Everyone was asking the same question. How does a woman just disappear in broad daylight? Her photo was everywhere. On telephone poles, in store windows, across social media feeds that refreshed by the second. News outlets arrived from outside the region. Reporters stood at the edge of the intersection where her phone had been found, pointing to the grass, the mailbox cluster, the quiet road where life had suddenly stopped feeling safe. And at the center of it all was Keith. Every day, cameras followed him. His voice cracked during interviews. His eyes looked exhausted, hollow. He begged whoever might be watching, whoever might know something, to please bring his wife back, softly, pleading our kids need their mom. Donations poured in. A reward was announced. Strangers offered help, meals, money, prayers. Online groups formed overnight, dedicated solely to finding Sherry. Tips flooded in hundreds of them, most leading nowhere. But as the attention grew, so did the scrutiny. Investigators did what they always do in cases like this. They started close to home. Keith was interviewed, then interviewed again and again. They asked about arguments, about money, about trust, about whether Sherry had ever talked about leaving. Keith answered everything. He handed over his phone, his computer. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He insisted he had nothing to hide, and for a while, nothing concrete tied him to her disappearance. Still, doubts lingered. Some people online began dissecting his body language. Others questioned his calmness. A few thought he seemed too emotional, too rehearsed. Everyone had a theory. Meanwhile, the physical search began to slow. No footprints, no blood, no witnesses who could say for sure what they'd seen. Just one report. A woman matching Sherry's description, jogging along a nearby road earlier that afternoon. And after that, nothing. As dice, passed hope started to thin. Investigators faced a difficult reality. Either Sherry had been taken by a stranger, or she had left on her own. And both possibilities carried disturbing implications. Because if she was abducted, someone dangerous was still out there. And if she left willingly, then everything the public believed might be wrong. As the ground search stalled, investigators shifted their focus. If Ariadne T left a trail behind her, maybe she'd left one digitally. Phones, messages, emails, online accounts. At first, nothing stood out. Routine texts, parenting logistics, casual conversations. But then, buried deeper, patterns began to emerge. Sherry had been talking to someone. Not a friend. Not family. Someone from her past. The messages weren't explicit. At least not at first. They were friendly, nostalgic, casual check-ins that slowly turned more personal, flirtatious, emotional, and Theoden T stopped weeks before she vanished. They continued, right up until the day before she disappeared. Investigators tracked down the man. He lived far away, hundreds of miles from Sherry's home. When questioned, he didn't run. He didn't hide. He cooperated fully. He admitted they'd talked, admitted there had once been feelings, but denied ever meeting her recently. And his story checked out. Phone records, location data alibis. Nothing placed him anywhere near Sherry when she vanished. So Ifo wasn't he responsible? Why hadn't Sherry told anyone about him? That question led investigators somewhere uncomfortable. They began asking whether Sherry had been unhappy, whether she'd talked about leaving, whether she'd felt trapped. Friends gave mixed answers. Some said Sherry complained often, about money, about marriage, about feeling stuck. Others said she exaggerated, but her stories shifted depending on the audience. One friend made a claim that stopped investigators cold. She said Sherry had told her just days before disappearing that her husband had threatened her if she ever tried to leave. It was a serious allegation, one that demanded attention. Police dug into it immediately. They searched for past reports, medical records, witnesses. Anything to support the claim. They found nothing. No calls, no reports, no history of violence. And when they spoke to others close to the couple, many said they'd never seen anything like that. Some admitted Sherry could be volatile during arguments. Emotional, loud, but abusive. The stories didn't line up. Meanwhile, Keith continued to cooperate. He agreed to tests, interviews, even procedures most lawyers would strongly advise against. And slowly, publicly, investigators began to say something unexpected. They did not believe he was involved. The announcement stunned the public and quietly shifted the spotlight. If the husband didn't do it, if no stranger had been identified, then the most uncomfortable possibility moved to the front. What if Sherry hadn't been taken at all? What if she had walked away? 22 days. That's how long Sherry had been missing when the phone rang. It was just before dawn, the kind of hour when bad news usually arrives. A driver had called emergency services after spotting a woman on the side of a highway. She was disoriented, weak, barely able to stand. She was asking for help. When officers arrived, they immediately knew something was wrong. The woman was underweight. Her hair had been cut short and uneven. Bruises covered her body, some fresh, others older. A chain was wrapped around her waist, and then she gave her name. It was Sherry. Within minutes, the story exploded. News alerts went out across the country. The missing mother had been found alive more than 100 miles from where she vanished. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly. Sherry was dehydrated, malnourished, and visibly shaken. She told nurses she had been held captive, that she'd been beaten, starved, controlled. Keith was notified and rushed to her side. When he entered the room, he later said he felt two things at once: relief and disbelief. Sherry looked fragile, broken, and yet alive. Slowly, for weeks, people had prayed for this moment, and now it was here. Sherry told investigators she'd been abducted during her run by multiple women, that she'd been blindfolded, driven far away, and kept locked in a small room. She described chains, darkness, loud music, threats. Her injuries seemed to support her claims. The nation reacted instantly. Support poured in again, louder than before. Headlines praised her strength. Strangers called her a survivor, a miracle, a symbol of hope. But as the shock settled, investigators began listening carefully. Sherry's story was detailed, extremely detailed. Some parts too precise, others vague when clarity mattered most. And then, inconsistencies began to appear. Small ones at first. Where she was held, how long certain events lasted, how she escaped. Details changed slightly each time she told it. Doctors noted some injuries didn't match the timeline she described. Some wounds appeared, others lacked signs expected from prolonged restraint. Still, trauma can do strange things to memory. Authorities didn't accuse her, not yet. But behind the scenes, doubt was quietly growing. Because if Sherry had truly been taken, then someone, somewhere, had left evidence. And the evidence was about to speak. For weeks, investigators had listened. They had taken notes. They had let Sherry talk. Now, it was time to test what she was saying against what could be proven. Forensic teams examined the clothes Sherry had been wearing when she was found. The fabric told a story of its own dirt patterns. Fibers where marks. Everything was catalogued, documented, preserved. And then came the DNA results. There was DNA on her clothing that didn't belong to her, or to her husband. That alone wasn't shocking. After all, she claimed she'd been held captive. But what mattered wasn't just that the DNA existed, it was whose it was. The profile didn't match any woman. It belonged to a man. Investigators ran it through databases. At first, nothing came back. No direct match. No criminal record. Just silence. But they didn't stop there. They used a different approach. familial DNA, a method that looks for partial matches, relatives, rather than exact identities. And this time something hit. The DNA pointed toward a family line, and when detectives followed that line, it led them somewhat unexpected. Not to a stranger, not to a criminal ring, but to someone Sherry already knew. Someone from her past. They didn't rush. They gathered records. Travel data, rental agreements, phone logs, surveillance footage. Piece by piece, a timeline began to form. Phone records showed calls Sherry had made that she hadn't mentioned, messages sent from devices she claimed not to have used, gaps in her story that lined up too neatly with documented movement. The man was located hundreds of miles away. When agents approached him, it was stunned. Not defensive, not angry, confused. At first, he denied everything. A. Saeed, A. Aden, T. Seen Sherry, in you. But when detectives laid out the evidence, the DNA, the records, the details only someone inside a private space would know, his story changed. Slowly, painfully. He admitted Sherry had contacted him, that she'd said she was desperate, that she needed help escaping a situation she claimed was dangerous. He said she asked him to come get her. And against his better judgment, thief. This wasn't an abduction. It was a plan that had spiraled far beyond anything either of them imagined. As investigators listened, a chilling realization set in. The injuries, the weight loss, the chains. They weren't proof of captivity. They were part of the performance. And now, everything had to be re-examined from the beginning. When investigators brought Sherry back in for questioning, the tone had changed. This wasn't about filling in gaps anymore. This was about confronting contradictions. They didn't accuse her outright. Not yet. Instead, they walked her through her own story, slowly, carefully, asking her to repeat details she'd shared before. Where she was held, how the room looked, what she heard, what she felt. At first, Sherry answered confidently. Her voice trembled, but the words came. Easily, she described the space again. The darkness, the cold, the fear. She spoke about the chain, the sounds, the isolation. Then detectives began placing photographs in front of her. A room, a table, a closet. Her breathing changed. The photos weren't random. They were taken from a home hundreds of miles away, a place investigators now believed Sherry had stayed willingly. And the details were unmistakable. The closet layout, the shelving, a metal bar positioned exactly where she had described it. Sherry stared at the images longer than expected. She said she wasn't sure, that trauma made memories blurry, that it looked similar, but not exact, that the room matched her descriptions too closely to ignore. Detectives pressed gently but firmly. They asked how she could describe features so precisely if she'd been blindfolded most of the time. They asked why her timeline kept shifting, why her injuries didn't align with her claims. Sherry became emotional. C'est create. She asked for breaks. She said she was overwhelmed. Then they told her about the DNA. They explained where it was found, what it meant, and whose it belonged to. They told her the man had already spoken, that he had passed questioning, that he had given details only someone directly involved could know. For a long moment, Sherry said nothing. The room felt heavy, still. Finally, she spoke, but not with a confession. She said she didn't want anyone else to get in trouble, that she just wanted everything to stop, that she wanted to go home and be with her children. But the truth was already closing in. Detectives explained calmly, almost sadly, that the story she told couldn't survive the evidence anymore. That the community, the donors, the volunteers, everyone who had searched for her deserved honesty. Sherry asked for a lawyer. The interview ended, but outside that room, the case was no longer a mystery. It was something else entirely. Once Sherry asked for a lawyer, investigators stopped pushing her. They didn't need to anymore. Behind closed doors, Detectives began reconstructing the timeline. Not from what Sherry said, but from what the evidence showed. Phone records revealed months of secret communication. Messages sent late at night, calls made from numbers that didn't belong to her or Keith. Devices she had never mentioned, prepaid phones, unregistered accounts. It was methodical. Planned. Investigators traced financial activity next. Small withdrawals. Purchases that didn't match family routines. Receipts from places Sherry claimed she had never been. And then there were the travel records. A rental car, an overnight drive. Surveillance footage from gas stations hundreds of miles away. Everything lined up. According to investigators, Sherry had arranged to leave on her own. She had coordinated a pickup. She had gotten into the back seat of a car and disappeared by choice. What followed wasn't a kidnapping. It was confinement, but not the kind she described. The man told investigators Sherry stayed inside his home, that she took over a room, that she barely left, that he slept on the couch while she isolated herself. He said she controlled the narrative. She told him what to do, what marks to leave, what injuries would look real. Some wounds, doctors later confirmed, were self. Others were caused under her instruction. Weight loss came from starvation, intentional, prolonged, and extreme. The chain, purchased, applied. Part of the story she was building. As the weeks passed, the media continued praising her survival, unaware that behind the scenes, the truth was unraveling rapidly. Investigators were careful. They knew how explosive this would be. How angry the public would feel. How betrayed. They also knew one thing clearly. This wasn't just a lie. It was a hoax that consumed thousands of hours of police work, millions in resources, hundreds of volunteers, and a nation's attention diverted away from real victims. And yet, the most painful fallout hadn't even begun, because the people hurt the most weren't strangers. They were the ones who loved her. When the truth began to surface, the damage spread quietly at first. Friends who had searched the fields, volunteers who had given up sleep, donors who had emptied savings to help bring Sherry home. All of them were left asking the same question. Why? Keith was among the last to fully accept it. For weeks after Sherry's return, he had defended her publicly and privately. He had stood beside her in interviews. He had comforted her through nightmares. He had rearranged his entire life to make her feel safe. Security cameras, lights on at all hours, doors locked twice. Even as doubts crept in, Keith told himself one thing. No one could fake that level of suffering, but the evidence didn't care about belief. When investigators finally explained what they had uncovered, Keith listened in silence. He asked questions, clarifying ones, painful ones, the kind you ask when part of you already knows the answer. And then he broke. Not in anger. In grief, because the realization wasn't just that Sherry had lied. It was that she had let him take the fall. For weeks, he had been viewed as a suspect. Questioned, watched, judged. All while she knew the truth. Their home became unbearable. Conversations ended in arguments or silence. Trust had evaporated, and for the sake of their children, distance became unavoidable. Outside the family, the community felt betrayed. Search groups disbanded. Donors demanded refunds. Some people apologized for ever doubting law enforcement. Others apologized for believing Sherry at all. The media shifted overnight. Headlines that once praised survival now spoke of deception. Articles that once showed smiling family photos now highlighted inconsistencies in court filings. But even as anger grew, something else followed close behind. Discomfort. Because this case forced people to confront something unsettling, that empathy can be manipulated, that public outrage can be steered, that belief, once weaponized, can cause real harm, and that realization was about to turn into consequences. Because investigators weren't finished, and what Sherry had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was criminal. Once investigators closed the loop on what really happened, the case shifted hands. This was no longer just a missing persons investigation. It became a federal matter. Prosecutors reviewed every step of the timeline, the false statements, the staged evidence, the money raised, and the public resources consumed. Each detail added weight. Each lie had a cost attached to it. They focused first on the statements Sherry made to law enforcement. Every interview, every claim, every detail she insisted was true, because lying to federal investigators isn't a misunderstanding. It's a felony. Then came the financial trail. Donations meant for search efforts, victim compensation funds, public money spent on overtime, helicopters, forensic analyses. Millions of dollars in resources had been diverted, not just wasted, but taken away from real victims who needed help. Prosecutors knew this case would be controversial. They moved carefully, methodically. They wanted something airtight, not emotional. Undeniable. Undeniable. Meanwhile, Sherry continued to maintain her innocence publicly. Through attorneys, she expressed remorse for confusion and misunderstandings, but not for the story itself. She still framed herself as a victim, still hinted at trauma, still avoided direct accountability. That strategy didn't last long. When formal charges were finally filed, the response was immediate. Outrage flooded social media. Former supporters felt humiliated. Others felt vindicated. The charges were serious. Multiple counts tied to fraud and false statements, potential prison time, restitution, supervised release. For the first time since the story began, the narrative was no longer hers to control, and as the legal process unfolded, another reality became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about one woman. It was about trust and how easily it can be broken. The courtroom felt nothing like the press conferences. There were no cameras flashing inside. No crowds cheering or condemning. Just rows of benches, muted voices, and the weight of consequences finally settling in. Sherry appeared smaller than she once had on television. No carefully rehearsed statements. No emotional appeals. Just reality. Prosecutors laid out the case piece by piece. They didn't dramatize it. They didn't need to. The facts were enough. They spoke about the false reports, the staged evidence, the deliberate planning that stretched back months before her disappearance. They explained how every agency involved had trusted her words, and how that trust had been exploited. They spoke about the money, funds meant to support a search that never should have existed. Compensation intended for victims of real crimes, public resources diverted while other cases went unanswered. Then came the impact statements. Law enforcement officers described sleepless nights, missed time with families, the emotional toll of chasing a nightmare that had been manufactured from the start. Community members spoke about fear, how people stopped jogging alone, how parents became hypervigilant, how suspicion lingered long after the truth emerged. And then there was Keith. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack. He spoke quietly about betrayal, about defending someone he loved while unknowingly being set up as a suspect, about the confusion his children faced, about rebuilding a life on top of something that never should have happened. When it was Sherry's turn to speak, the room went still. She read from a prepared statement. Her voice wavered. She said she was ashamed. She apologized for the pain she caused. She said she would spend the rest of her life trying to make amends. But for many in the room, it felt incomplete, because apologies don't erase consequences, and remorse doesn't undo damage. The judge made that clear. The sentence wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about sending a message that fabricating trauma harms everyone. When the gavel finally came down, the chapter closed. But the story didn't end there. The sentence didn't bring relief. Not the kind people expect. Anyway, there was no feeling of victory, no sense of closure, no clean emotional ending. For the community, it felt more like exhaustion than justice, like everyone had been holding their breath for years, and finally exhaled. Sherry was taken into custody quietly. No spectacle, no chaos, no dramatic exit, just paperwork, handcuffs, and a door closing behind her. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited, but Keith didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said more than any interview ever could. For him, the legal case was over, but the personal damage was just beginning. At home, life had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Not symbolically, literally. New routines, new rules, new boundaries. New, normal. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a recovery space. His children carried questions they were too young to fully understand, but too old to ignore. Where's Mom? Why can't we see her? Did we do something wrong? And there were no easy answers. Keith focused on stability, consistency, structure, safety. He became both parents overnight, emotionally and practically. School drop-offs, homework, doctor appointments, nightmares, therapy sessions, reassurance. Every day, the community, once united in search efforts, now felt fractured. Some people felt betrayed. Some felt angry. Some felt embarrassed for believing. Some still felt sympathy. Public opinion split into camps. She's sick. She's evil. She needs help. She deserves prison. She's a victim of her mind. She is a manipulator, but the truth lived in the damage. Local organizations reported a rise in skepticism toward real victims. People questioned missing persons cases more harshly. Tips slowed. Trust eroded. Doubt replaced urgency. Advocacy groups spoke out about the ripple effects, how one fabricated story can make real victims harder to believe, and that damage couldn't be undone with any sentence. In Cita Prison, Sherry lived a completely different reality. No cameras. No attention. No narrative control. Just routine. Schedules. Cells. Silence. Isolation. The story that once dominated headlines became irrelevant inside those walls. She was just another inmate. Another file. Another number. Another case. And outside, the world moved on. But not everyone could. Because some stories don't end when the court case does. They end when the emotional damage finally fades. And for many people connected to this story, that process had only just begun. Looking back, this case left behind more than court documents and headlines. It left lessons, uncomfortable ones. It showed how quickly a story can take control once it captures emotion. How fear spreads faster than facts. How empathy, when rushed, can be redirected in ways no one expects. People wanted to believe. They needed to believe. A missing mother, a loving family, a community rallying together. It fit a narrative that felt familiar and safe. But safety is an illusion when truth takes a backseat. Investigators later admitted something important. Early assumptions shaped everything that followed. Once the idea of an abduction took hold, every detail was filtered through that lens. Contradictions were explained away. Red flags were softened. Questions were postponed. Not because of incompetence, but because of humanity. Because no one wants to be the person who doubts a victim. This case forced a reckoning. Law enforcement agencies reviewed how they balanced compassion with verification. Media outlets questioned how they frame stories before evidence is complete. Advocacy groups emphasized that skepticism and empathy don't have to be opposites. You can care and still question. Perhaps the hardest lesson was this. Full stories don't just disappear when exposed. They leave damage behind. Two real victims who now face doubt. Two communities that hesitate before helping. Two families who become collateral damage. For Keith, the lesson was deeply personal. He learned that love doesn't make someone honest. That loyalty doesn't protect you from betrayal. That sometimes the person you're trying to save is the one causing the harm. But he also learned something hopeful. That life doesn't end with public humiliation. That children can grow beyond chaos. That peace is possible, even without answers. This case is often remembered for deception, but it should also be remembered for resilience, not the manufactured kind. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, but keeps going anyway. Years have passed since the story first broke. For most people, it's a case they vaguely remembered, something they once saw on the news, argued about online, then moved on from. But for the people who lived it, the echoes are still there. Keith lives a deliberately quiet life now. No public statements. No media appearances. No attempts to set the record straight. He has learned that peace doesn't come from convincing strangers. It comes from protecting what matters. His children are older now. They understand more than he wishes they did, but less than the internet assumes. They know their family story is complicated. They know not everyone will be kind. They know some questions don't have answers, and they're okay with that. What matters most is that they feel safe, that they feel believed, that they feel grounded, that their lives aren't defined by a single event they didn't choose. As for Sherry, her name still resurfaces from time to time. Articles, podcasts, comment threads. Each retelling strips away a little more humanity, reducing a person to a cautionary tale. Some people still argue she was mentally unwell and needed help, not punishment. Others believe the sentence was too light. Others think it was too harsh. But Sherry herself rarely speaks publicly now, and when she does, it's carefully measured, filtered through lawyers, wrapped in distance. The story no longer belongs to her. It belongs to history, and history is rarely forgiving. For the broader public, the case left a lasting imprint. Missing person stories are now met with a pause, a moment of hesitation. Not disbelief, but caution. People still care. They still share. They still search. But they ask more questions now. And maybe that's not a bad thing. With enough distance, stories change. They lose their urgency, their sharp edges, their grip on daily life. But what remains is meaning. This case is often summarized in a single word: hoax. And while that word is accurate, it's also incomplete, because it doesn't capture the fear people felt when a mother vanished. It doesn't reflect the sleepless nights of volunteers searching in the dark. It doesn't explain the way trust fractured when the truth emerged, and it certainly doesn't account for the children who grew up inside the fallout. At its core, this story is about belief. How quickly we believe, why we believe, and what happens when belief is misplaced. It's about the stories we tell ourselves that bad things happen to good people, that suffering is always visible, that truth eventually reveals itself cleanly. Reality is messier. Truth arrives slowly, often incomplete, sometimes too late, and when it does arrive, it doesn't undo what came before. It only asks us to respond differently next time. For law enforcement, this case reinforced the need for balance, empathy paired with verification. For the media, it exposed how narratives can form before facts are settled, and how difficult it is to correct course once a story takes hold. For the public, it served as a reminder that compassion should not require abandoning critical thought. You can support victims without suspending judgment. You can care deeply without rushing to conclusions. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all, not every story has a villain and a hero. Sometimes there are only people, flawed, complicated, human, making choices that ripple outward in ways they can't control. The story didn't end with justice feeling satisfying. It ended with acceptance. Acceptance that harm was done. Acceptance that some questions remain unanswered. Acceptance that life continues anyway. In the end, this story isn't remembered for how it began. It's remembered for what it revealed. It showed how easily fear can spread when uncertainty takes over, how quickly a community can unite, and how deeply it can be hurt when trust is broken. It exposed cracks in systems, in assumptions, and in the stories we're often too eager to believe. But it also showed something quieter. Resilience. Not the dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the kind that shows up every day without applause. A father choosing stability over bitterness. Children learning they're more than their past. A community learning to question without becoming cruel. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense. No perfect explanation. No clean emotional resolution. And maybe that's the point. Some stories don't exist to give us closure. They exist to make us more careful with our judgments, our outrage, and our trust. They remind us that truth is fragile. That belief carries responsibility. That empathy, while powerful, must be grounded in honesty. The consequences of this case will never fully disappear. They live in changed policies, in altered perceptions, in the hesitation that now follows stories of disappearance. But they also live in growth, in the way people ask better questions, in the way families protect one another, in the way lessons, once learned painfully, aren't forgotten. For those directly affected, life continuous, imperfect, quieter, but real. And for everyone else watching from the outside, this story leaves one final question behind. When the next story breaks, when emotions run high, when belief feels urgent, will we pause long enough to seek truth before choosing what to believe? Gentle pause. Thank you for listening.